Ethiopia's Human Rights Commission has condemned a wave of arrests of journalists. The number of media workers being held has reportedly now risen to 19. In addition, more than 6,000 people have been detained in the Amhara region.
Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, a government-affiliated rights body, has called the arrests unlawful. The Commission's head called the move a new low for a country that has been often accused of creating a hostile environment for independent media. The detentions continued on Saturday with the arrest of Maiza Mohammed, an editor of a YouTube-based news channel that has been critical of the government. She spent more than a month in detention late last year, when Ethiopia issued an emergency decree in connection with the civil war in the country.
And for an update, we're joined now by Angela Quintal, the Africa Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us, Angela. Much appreciated. Let's just start with the numbers that we have at the moment. Do we know, I mentioned earlier on that it's 19. Do we have a final figure of how many journalists have been arrested thus far?
Hi, good evening. Yeah, look, it's pretty fluid. In terms of the Committee to Protect Journalists, we've documented at least 15 journalists who are behind bars currently because of an act of journalism, because of their work, and we are investigating 3 others. So in terms of our count, we think at least 18. There has been figures of 19, but frankly, one journalist behind bars is just one journalist too many. But yeah, Ethiopia currently is actually the worst jailer of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa as I speak. Yeah.
Can you just share with us some of the incidents that you've heard reported of? I mean, we've heard of one of those that's been involved is Temesgen Desalegn, the editor-in-chief of the Amharic language magazine Fetih. What are you hearing about these incidents? How exactly do they occur?
Well, firstly, these are arbitrary arrests. These are arrests that are really not happening in terms of international law or due process. But we've certainly seen since 2018, when the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came into power, what we have seen is a deterioration in the environment for the press and more journalists being arrested. We saw an uptick after the civil war started in the north, in the Tigray region. And then we saw the use of the state of emergency, and that was really giving the government powers to arrest and detain arbitrarily, and it was very difficult to get any information or actually see any process that one could say was due process, or that in terms of the law, that things were actually happening, at least in that sense that we knew that the journalists would get a fair hearing. Now, after the state of emergency was actually lifted earlier this year, you then saw many of the journalists were released, and we only had 2 journalists in jail until this month, where suddenly we saw this crackdown again in the Amhara region, where you had a wave of arrests of activists, of journalists, and that's when we've seen the sudden increase again of journalists behind bars. And none of them, we can't say that any of them have actually been charged that we're aware of. They've been detained from their homes, they've been detained from their offices, they've been detained arriving at the international airport in Ethiopia. So we've seen a crackdown. And I mean, this is repression in its worst form. It's not as though people are being picked up, can actually look to the law and see that they're going to have some sort of protection. And that's when we say it's arbitrary, and that's why we're asking and we're calling, and we all are calling, for these journalists and others to be released immediately.
I mean, just reading from past reports, some journalists have said when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came in that there was some sort of reform and there was a sense that there's going to be an expansion of media freedoms, but now that they actually fear a knock at their doors. But the reports that we're getting from Amhara region has been by law enforcement saying that those journalists that have been arrested, it was part of a roundup of an anti-crime operation. So is it couched like that, or are people actually being targeted?
People are definitely being targeted. And, this is the euphemism that governments will use. We've seen it everywhere. It's not only in Ethiopia, but when you have a situation where, the so-called motive is a crime operation, or it's because people are terrorists. And really what it is repression. It is a government moving against those who are its critics. It's an attempt by government to close down that democratic space, to ensure that dissent is being stopped. And so certainly, when you're talking about over 5,000 people who've been arrested and been detained en masse, that's not a law enforcement operation. That is a catch-all attempt to try and stop anyone who is actually critical of the government.
In some cases, there is a YouTuber who's being reported as being held by police, being accused of incitement through his work, and they're citing media laws. Can you give us a sense of, for somebody like this who does use social media to do their work, how does the Ethiopian government use it, as you say, to subjugate journalists and say that they are spreading hate or anti-government speech?
Look, don't get me wrong. It's not as though there isn't disinformation and that there isn't, room to be concerned about incitement. But the problem is that incitement is then used as a catch-all phrase, a bit like terrorism, where you are using laws to ensure that you're able to crack down, right? And so what we're seeing is people being accused, for example, of incitement. And yet when you look at why they've been accused, there's absolutely no rhyme or reason as to why they could possibly been told that it's incitement. So some of these YouTubers, for example, haven't even given interviews or haven't even appeared over the past couple of years, and suddenly now they're being accused of being inciting violence. So again, it really is a case that often you do see that the laws of a country are so broad, as I said, the anti-terror law, hate speech laws and so on, that it's actually, you're able to then use it as a government to move against people who are really critics. But you're able to use a situation because the law is so broad to then pick up everyone. And as I say, have these mass arrests as we've seen over the past couple of days.
There have been reports of journalists who've had their homes raided, their tapes or works confiscated. Just how dangerous is it as working journalists in Ethiopia now? The US State Department calling it a narrowing of the space in terms of freedom of expression. Is it becoming that dangerous to operate within that space?
Very much so. And in fact, you have many journalists who have actually left and have tried to get out of the country. And then you have the censorship, obviously, and the self-censorship. So yes, it is very difficult being a journalist in Ethiopia. There's a case of, for example, when the Tigray war was at its worst, you didn't have people who were able to actually go there. You had journalists fleeing the Tigray. You had journalists who were being targeted, not only because of their journalism, but because of their because they were Tigrayans. And so there is a atmosphere of fear there. I mean, we get, often people are calling on us, telling us that they are concerned, that they are very worried, they want to get out, or else they have already left, and that they're now effectively no man's land, in exile, and needing support. So it's incredibly worrying. The local journalists are obviously the ones who are facing the worst kind of repression. Those who remain behind, many of them are in hiding. And then you also have the blackout in terms of the international press. I mean, just, in 1 year alone, we've had 2 international journalists who've been expelled. One from the New York Times in May last year, Simon Marks, and now just recently, we had The Economist's correspondent who was booted out. So you really have a situation where it's very, very difficult to try and get, people on the ground who are there to report. One, because if they do, they're going to be arrested. Their homes are going to be raided, as we saw with Lucy Casa. Or if you're an international journalist, you're going to be told that you're so in division or whatever, and then you're booted out. You're given 48 hours to get out of the country. So yes, the atmosphere there, unfortunately, it is, this is an understatement. It's not good. And it is really in terms of trying to ensure, and I think this is ultimately what we need to focus on here, is that at a time when you really do need more information, that you need a plurality of media, where you need independent media and not only his master's voice, where the citizens themselves deserve to know what is going on in their country, that you're seeing the closing down of that civic space, and that obviously is of huge concern.
There have been calls for some of those that have been detained to be released. Do you have an idea of how progressive those talks are at the moment? And is there an ability to appeal to the government to relax the clamping down on journalists and the environment?
I must say that what I have seen is a hardening of attitude from the Ethiopian government. There would have been a time when you were able to at least talk to officials, but there certainly is a feeling from government itself that they are under siege and there is this pushback. The international community certainly has been putting pressure on the administration. The point is that there's massive disappointment the world over. In 2018, when Prime Minister Abiy took power, there certainly was a feeling that the reform was in the air. For goodness sake, he got the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2018, when he took over, at the end of that year, 2018, there was not one single journalist in jail. And everyone was really, really excited about the fact that a country as important as Ethiopia on our continent, that there was reform in the air, and that we were going to see a new liberated Ethiopia that was really going to be the gold standard of democracy on our continent. In 2019, when World Press Freedom Day was in Addis, I think on May the 3rd, when it was celebrated there. Prime Minister Abiy went onto that stage and told the international community that there was not a single journalist in jail. He spoke about the reforms and the media laws that was going to happen. And there really was a great, great sense that, there was hope. 3 years down the line, and you now have, as I speak, you have Ethiopia as the worst jailer of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa. And the way that it's going, it might even top the number of journalists currently in jail in Egypt, and could well become the worst jailer of journalists in Africa. This is just, wow. If you're talking about backsliding, Ethiopia has certainly shown the world that it has certainly, the backsliding is there, and that hope has gone out of the window.
Thank you so much for your time and for that update. Much appreciated. Angela Quintal, the Africa Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists.